UMBAR are another one of the evil factions that have very clear links to a more good-aligned past, with the fact that the Númenórean influence throughout their roster is very, very clear. Also, they have perhaps one of the better defined histories within Middle-earth among the forces of evil men at the very least, purely because you can very clearly draw their lineage back through Númenor, and even, at a later date, the split that happened when the Númenóreans have fallen really into their successor states that you see in the more modern era of Middle-earth with, the forces of Arnor and Gondor, of course. Names like Castamere and Elendil are the ones that are most relevant to Umbar's history, because when we meet Umbar here in these games in the era that they're in, they're no longer really the terrifying tour de force that the Númenóreans once were. While they still have some of that influence about them, the blood has thinned from them as it has from the other Númenórean successor states as well, albeit I'm sure that the higher-ups would not be too pleased to hear that. But speaking about how they act militarily, perhaps lore-wise the most interesting thing about Umbar would be how their naval prowess plays into things, but of course in 3rd Age Reforged naval combat is not on the table, so it is purely about how they take care of business on land. And speaking about some of their strengths and weaknesses, we'll go through what they're good at first. The Black Númenórean units are really the central pillar around which you will play as Umbar, and this isn't only on foot. Their cavalry is more limited, but the Black Númenórean cavalry is still pretty strong. It's not as good at the really high end when compared to the very best cavalry in the game, but it is certainly more than enough to give you that presence on the field should you require it. It is the infantry, of course, which is the main focus of any Númenórean faction really, and Umbar are certainly no different there, and their high tier Black Númenórean units are very strong, both in terms of their defensive ability and also their ability to dish out damage. The latter of those two is probably the more significant thing. It means that even their more defensively aligned units, and this will be the sort of thing which we dip into as well when we talk about Númenor proper, is the fact that they are capable of dishing out some really impressive damage levels with even their line infantry units, which are a traditionally more defensive option. And the ability to do that means that you can wear enemy forces down a little bit more easily with your infantry. They don't have quite the same numbers problems, being a human kingdom, as forces like the elves and dwarves, for example. So while they don't have the numbers of the orcs, they do have a pretty happy middle ground, and the quality that the Black Númenórean units bring in that regard is very important to their compositions. And speaking of which, following directly on from that, really it's only the higher end Númenórean units that this applies to. They do have locked morale on their higher tier units, which, the presence of this is a little bit more prevalent, shall we say, than in many other factions, especially among the human kingdoms. And it means that it's a little bit more difficult to get rid of Umbar completely. Now, there is a bit of a split in their roster between those high tier, the upper echelon of their society with their Black Númenóreans, and then, the lower tiers with the Corsairs. Of course, the Corsairs, much easier to rout and cause panic in their ranks. But to get rid of the core of Umbar's army is a lot more difficult, and that can make the difference, especially late on in a game where both armies are, maybe starting to waver a little bit generally. Exhaustion starts to set in. It's the sort of thing which you can see yourself over the line as Umbar with, because, morale is less of an issue for them, certainly than the other evil men factions as a general rule. Rudar have got some good morale as well, but locked morale is on another level, of course, and that gives you that fallback option as Umbar, which is always welcome when you're playing as them. And finally, as is the case with many of these more heavy-duty human kingdoms, range support is a big part of what Umbar do. Now, in terms of their archer selection, it's not as varied as the likes of Gondor, but it's more of the fact that they have access to really good javelin hybrid unit, they have crossbows, they have some good mounted options, and also they have those heavy archers. So it's more the range of ranged units that they have available to them, and in all of these areas you will be able to point at a faction which does it slightly better, but Umbar are one of those where they have most of their bases covered. A slinger is really the only thing that a slinger and axe thrower are the two things that they are outright missing, but other than that they've got everything covered really, and that is a really good in conjunction with their main infantry force. This is the main way in which Umbar are going to be going about their business. Sort of everything is built around having that infantry dominance and then being able to deploy that effectively, and the ranged support, and also the cavalry to a slightly lesser extent because it is a bit more defensively orientated around safeguarding your infantry. All of that works together to mean that you can sort of deliver that really heavy duty punch to your enemy. And obviously how they do that is slightly different to the likes of the Dwarves or Angmar, for example, because it is, you know, quality focused, but with numbers and support being a little bit more important for UMBAR than it is certainly for Angmar, but also the way that they handle their support is also different to the Dwarves. So it's just about really, you know, making sure that that balance is correct, but the delivery of that quality is important. But UMBAR do have their downsides as well, and the main one really is the fact that they are more expensive than most other Evil Men factions. I mean, this isn't a blanket statement, because of course they do have their lower tier Corsairs, which in comparison to the previous version of the game are a more important aspect of UMBAR's roster now. So it isn't actually as extreme, this weakness, as it used to be perhaps, but it does mean that you have to get the balance right. You have to play unit Tetris a little bit, and it means that you have to focus on certain things. You can't really be a jack of all trades as UMBAR that easily, because in order to do that effectively you need your high tier units in each of these areas to be on the field, but very often you'll run out of funds before you do that, or if you bring all of them, your army size is going to be far too small and you're going to get overrun too easily. So that is the conundrum that you face when you're building your UMBAR army. And yeah, I would say that while they don't run into this as much, obviously, as elves or dwarves, which it is really the central problem with their factions overall, and indeed when you compare them to Numenor, who we will be looking at next time, they do at least have those Corsair units to be able to supplement their force, but that comes with its own set of problems, which we'll talk about in just a moment. But again, it is all about judgment, and it's all about the situation as well. I think UMBAR are one of those factions which you are going to see pretty different compositions depending on whether you're in a siege, defending or attacking, or in the open field. It can vary up a little bit, and you will have to pick your army accordingly because of the expense of those high tier units. However, they do have access to lower end units, but it is a bit of a weakness of theirs as well. The weaker Corsair units that they have at their disposal are an important part of their roster now. And it's not a complete weakness in the sense that it's good to have these cheaper units to be able to pad your army out a little bit, but if you are too reliant on them, they will let you down, is the thing. You do need that quality with them for them to be really useful. Now, it is worth saying as well that the main problem with the Corsairs is the fact that they are very, very flimsy. You know, even the entry-level fodder unit, whose job is basically to die, in most other factions, this kind of unit will at least come with a small shield to be able to absorb ranged fire a little bit more easily. The Corsairs do not have that. And even some of the examples of better Corsair units, such as the crossbows, of course, with the damage that they can kick out, they are very flimsy. They are very glass cannon-esque, and you do have to look after them. So that is definitely worth bearing in mind if you're intent on going more numbers heavy with UMBAR, which is at least an option now, whereas before it really wasn't. But you do need to make sure that you have that quality in conjunction with them. It's kind of the inverse, really, of bringing too many high-tier units. If you depend too much on these lower tiers, they're not really going to do the business for you. And the final thing, I mean, it's a little bit of a general sweeping statement, this, but they have relatively few options in some unit categories. We already mentioned some of the missing things they have. I mean, slingers are a relatively rare unit type anyway, but they don't have axe throwers, which would be a nice thing for them to have as well. Their cavalry selection is pretty good, but it's also very small and very expensive, so that is going to cut into your unit types that you can bring on foot. Again, they only really have one dedicated heavy archer. They've got one unit of rangers, which is fine, but again, it's mostly they have one unit to do a job, whereas other factions, for example, Dale, who, very much a heavy archer faction, have got multiple options in that regard. Gondor, of course, have got multiple options in that regard. When it comes to the dwarves, they've got plenty of units of heavy infantry that can either be defensive or offensive at the high and low tiers. For UMBAR, it tends to be the case that you have one unit to do a job, and that's it. So that can be a little bit of a concern for you, because it means that depending on who you're up against, it's relatively easy, I think, to guess at what an UMBAR composition might be like. If you're on the open field, you're more likely to see the cavalry, for example. If you're in a siege, obviously they're going to dump an awful lot into their Naru units and the Alcarondas Legion and stuff like that. But yeah, it's one of those where you can be savvy with your composition building as UMBAR, but weirdly, even though you do have that, there are potential pitfalls when it comes to choosing your composition, and it can be a bit of a challenge. I feel like it's weirdly simple for the opposition to get a bearing on what you're doing because of the more limited options you have in some of these unit categories. But that is much better explained when we can actually see UMBAR on the grassy plain. So we'll hop over there now and start looking through their roster in detail. So UMBAR has been the case with quite a few of the factions that we've seen, especially many of the human kingdoms. We're going to have to divide the roster, and much of this is down to the fact that many of them do have varying levels of armour upgrades, which is not too dissimilar to their classic rivals in the Gondorians just to the north. But they're the first faction, probably will be the only one, considering the limited amount that we still have left to look at, that we have to split it not only, basically the skirmishers are going to have to be split right down the middle as well, so it's only the archers that we've got on the field for the moment. They do have some specialty skirmishers in other respects as well. We didn't have enough room to fit them onto the roster here, so they're going to have to go with the cavalry and the artillery, and much of this is based around the fact that there's a lot of infantry options that you have as UMBAR, although a lot of it is also bound up in varying armour upgrades. And we shall start off with the entry-level units being the Corsairs, which I did mention them especially really in terms of what they bring to the table in terms of their weakness. When you have a look at what they actually have to offer in melee terms, I mean, the attack is slightly higher than you would expect to see from this equivalent unit from other factions, fodder tier, considering they only cost 100 after all. And the defensive skill of 9 is pretty decent as well, considering the very, very low cost. You do have the option to upgrade the armour as well, which gives them a little bit more in terms of defense, and considering the armour by default is of course so low, this is the sort of thing which you may wish to dip into if you're going to be dependent on these kinds of units being more of a central pillar of your army. But many UMBAR players, I feel like, forego the armour upgrade and use them as the cannon fodder, which is not too surprising considering their low cost and the fact that UMBAR have got plenty of other things that they could be spending their money on. We did mention having to play Tetris a little bit with your money when it comes to building your compositions after all, so it could be a luxury you can't afford. But if you do combine that with the defensive skill, I mean, not terrible. The main issue that this unit has in comparison to many other fodder units from evil factions, they got the same numbers after all, is the fact they don't have a shield. And really absorbing ranged pressure either through sheer casualties or through being a little bit more hardy than you would expect them to be. A shield can be absolutely vital in those respects. It does mean that if you're especially in a blob in a siege, this is the kind of unit which isn't going to give you quite as much value for money. I can't off the top of my head think of too many other entry level units for which this is the case, certainly not among the units which only cost 100 after all. But it is of course swings and roundabouts. That higher defensive skill does mean they're going to be a little bit more dangerous in melee against other infantry, so it's really just dependent on what you value, and UMBAR do have plenty of really hardy units further on in their roster, especially when you consider the armour upgrades don't just stop here at the most entry level of units. And moving on, this is really where UMBAR, you'll see the vast majority of UMBAR's roster come into its own. We shall start off actually with an axe unit, the UMBAR Axe Guard. You can actually see they're wielding swords in that picture from long, long ago. But you can see this is the old Corsair Savages unit model, the baseline armour being 4, which is actually higher than you'd expect just from looking at them. But of course, big attack, big charge, the effectiveness against armour, reasonably cheap as well. Defensive skill of 6. I mean, it can be lower for entry-level axe units from evil factions, so that is something worth considering as well. And then you have both levels of armour upgrades. Obviously, it used to be called the Balakith Axe Guard, this being the first level, armour of 5, and then you can also upgrade them all the way to 6. Hold on a minute. Oh no, that is the fully upgraded version. Got this, the first level of armour upgrade here with the sort of rattan armour, and then these guys here. I got a bit confused because it used to be this was the entry level unit and then there was a full plate version, but this is now the highest level you can go to. Armour value of 5, again that just gives them a little bit more survivability, which heavy axe units, especially more entry level heavy axe units like this, really do need every bit of survivability they can get, because damage is not really their issue. They can chuck out plenty of damage, especially against units which are overly reliant on armour, but they themselves often have a little bit of an issue staying in the fight long term. The UMBAR Axe Guard, certainly not as much as other entry-level evil axe units for the same reason I've just mentioned, but still, it does help if you have them combined with some of your more defensively aligned units. 203 is a fairly high number of these axes as well, but if you combine them with your other more regular units as UMBAR, you will get better results. And you've got the Balagaya Footmen here. The entry-level version of them has remained unchanged for a while. Basic spears, the attack is not particularly high and it is subject to the spear malus, so they are pretty much the blunt opposite to the UMBAR Axe Guard in the sense that they are going to be almost purely a defensive unit, especially when it comes to infantry on infantry engagements. That effectiveness against cavalry does mean they will carry far more of a sting against those kinds of units, and good defensive values as well, with a higher baseline armor value, and obviously that shield which can come into play, which neither of the two units we've spoken about so far have access to. But 2 levels of armor upgrades once again, starting off with what used to be the only armor upgrade they had, which gives them thicker chain and padded coats in some cases, and then the final one which gives them the same sort of armor as some of the highest tier of Black Numenorian units have, in all fairness to them. The armor of 7 may not quite match the regal nature of their plate armor perhaps when you compare them to units from other factions, but it does still make them very, very survivable for a unit which is relatively cheap. Obviously, again, not particularly damaging, but they can outlast most other units of this type in comparison to other kingdoms of, certainly, evil men. When you compare them to the Gondorians, it's more or less equivalent. Maybe the Gondorians with a slight edge. I can't remember off the top of my head, but it is very much the same sort of thing that you will see from Arthedain and Gondor, which is not too surprising given their shared ancestry. And then they also have the Belagaea pikemen, which follow very much the same sort of thing, a little bit more expensive as you would expect from pikes. As an entry-level pike unit, again, stats have to be taken with a pinch of salt with this kind of unit, because the phalanx formation is so important to how they go about their business. Obviously, the effectiveness against cavalry is extremely pronounced with this kind of unit as well, but no self-respecting cavalry is going to be charging into them head first if they can help it. And again, the same style as well with the padded coats and chain, or the full plates, which of course can help offset a little bit at the very least the fact that they are unshielded. But an armor score of 7 does still mean that archers with a good amount of punch are still going to be able to do an awful lot of damage to them. So you have to really determine where your armor upgrades are best spent as UMBAR, but the pikes are another option that you can dip into there. Attack of 7, not too bad for an entry level unit of pikes either. 163, fairly standard. And then you have some slightly stronger units of, well, not necessarily mainline units in both cases, but certainly in this case, the Alcarondas Legion, an upper tier unit of line infantry, 800, which this kind of unit does crop up quite a lot. The dwarves have got good examples of this with stuff like the Erebor Legionaries. Of course, the elves do as well, with the Imladris Guardians and that sort of thing. Among the human kingdoms, interestingly enough, it's not quite as prevalent as you would expect it to be, but the Alcarondas Legion certainly step up in that regard, and you can see the big step up in terms of total defense that they offer, and that's because the armor and defensive skill combination that they bring to the table is very, very strong. They have that shield as well, which is fairly standard fare. Good attack at 11 as well for this kind of line infantry unit. 800 is a decent chunk of change, but I would say the Alcarondas Legion are absolutely worth every penny when you consider their stats here. They're also one of my favourite looking units in the game. You can see the old Numenorian style that they still carry with them, but with their own flair. In comparison to a unit which we'll talk about at a later date in a different faction, they do prioritise defence a little bit more than their Numenorian ancestors, who prioritise attack a little bit more. But I do think the defensive skill, combined with the fact that they are just a really solid unit all round, does make them mix very well as that quality core to a good front line. Inspiring nearby troops is a nice bonus as well, of course, outside of the locked morale units, which don't need it. And then over here, the Corsair Fencers, which are an assassin class unit. We've already mentioned the potential difficulties with using this kind of unit. Very, very strong in melee if you can get them isolated against certain units. Again, melee attack of 15. Good total defense, but that's almost entirely down to their extremely high defensive skill. If they do get isolated and archers can see them, then their very low armor means they're going to get ripped apart very, very quickly, but the fact they can hide anywhere is a decent offset to this weakness. Again, missile attack of 15. Most assassin class units are going to have exactly the same upsides and exactly the same downsides. How well they do their job very often is based around how quickly they can do their range damage, and then in melee they're all going to be pretty good against the same sort of things. It just depends on cost and that sort of thing. Outright melee damage, whether or not one is going to be stronger than the other. Causing fear is also quite nice. Obviously the armor piercing missiles as well. And then, just before we get into the bodyguard tier unit, they do have this very high-end unit of pikes, one of the finest units of pikes that the game has to offer. 1,000, again, pretty expensive, but the Naruna Aru Sentinels are very, very strong. And the main reason for this is I think they are the tankiest unit of pikes that have a shield. So many pikes, of course, even if they do have a shield, they wear it on their back, so the value is either 3 or less. They carry their shield from the front, so the value of 6 combined with the armor of 11 means they don't really have the same weakness to archers that that other units of pikes have, so it mitigates that fantastically. And at the centre of your line, of course, they're going to be very, very solid, good attack. Obviously, there are Elven and Dwarven pikes that we've spoken about in the past that are going to be superior in various ways to the Naru Naru, but as shielded pikes, I think they are the strongest that the game has to offer. Inspiring nearby troops is always very nice at the centre of your line for a unit that you know is going to be more of an anchoring point, more so than something you're going to be charging around the field with. And obviously, again, bonus against cavalry goes without saying. Phalanx formation, all important for this kind of unit. And then the only melee bodyguard unit they have, which is going to be fairly similar to many other units of this type, we have the Harbingers of Castamere. They're in their old guise with the dual wielding, but now with a two-handed sword. So obviously you look to the Vanguard of King Elisar, you look to the Pharazim Swordmasters, which we're yet to have a look at, the Haven Guard of Athalond as well. That kind of thing is what you can compare the Harbingers of Castamere to. They cause fear. Interestingly enough, they don't inspire nearby troops, which is an interesting omission considering most other units of this type have it. But as we've already mentioned, UMBAR don't necessarily need it quite so much. 1450 is a lot of money to spend, but when you look at the stats, obviously, sky-high defensive skill, really good armour, no shield, but the second hit point is always going to be present on a bodyguard unit, and then the monstrous attack of 35 with the charge of 20 as well means that you can do a huge amount of damage in the right sort of situations. But even when you get caught cold, really, you know, taking away the charge bonus, it's still going to be a very scary kind of unit. Interested to see as well, you know, when we compare them directly at some point in the future, which unit comes out on top of all the two-handed sword units, because the Harbingers are better than they used to be, I think. They used to be a little bit disappointing in class, but now I think looking at those stats, they're going to be far closer to their rivals. Now then, moving on, we have their entry-level archer, and again it's the Balagire archer, so it's the same sort of thing here, where you have the entry-level unit. They have then the slightly stronger version, chain and coats, and finally the variant over here, which do wear their shields on their backs, but it doesn't actually affect the shield value at all. Armour of 7, shield value of 4, 600. Honestly, one of the better units of heavy entry-level skirmishing archers that the game has to offer. The main issue with both UMBAR and with Numenor is the fact that, you know, you can only bring so many of them, and they only have one option at the entry level. Whereas when you compare that with factions, especially like Dale, and also Gondor to a slightly lesser extent, they can field more of this kind of unit. But against the vast majority of factions in the game, I think UMBAR are going to be very comfortable at skirmishing at long range on foot with their opposition. And this is going to be the main pillar that you build that around. We'll talk about the higher level units that they have for this kind of thing in a moment, but obviously the numbers and the meat of that is going to be provided by the Balagire. The damage, however, is going to be provided by something else, and as with many factions, UMBAR do have access to a ranger, the Rangers of Castamere, and in much the same sort of way as other classes of unit, it's not really too much that the Rangers of Castamere do different. They do have a missile attack of 9, which does set them a little bit more apart from some of the regular Rangers, for lack of a better term, and it brings them closer to something like the Elven forces, so that is interesting. Although do bear in mind that this is UMBAR's only really damaging unit of long range. Everything else is based around higher defense rather than offense, so there will still be stronger factions at long range that don't have access to this heightened missile attack on their rangers as a result of that. Decent in melee as well, again, almost entirely down to the defensive skill, really, because the armour and the overall staying power is in question, but 800 as well is very standard for a unit of rangers, just with a little bit more damage, which they do kind of need. But when you compare here, you've got the Naru Naru Royal Guard, who do have a good missile attack of 9 as well. If you look at them and compare them, then the unit that you would compare them most readily to, obviously as a bodyguard archer, kind of a bodyguard archer anyway, would probably be the Veterans of Osgiliath from Gondor. The only difference being the Veterans don't come with their highest level of armour, whereas the Naru Naru Royal Guard do. 2 hit points, 1200 is a lot for a unit of heavy archers, which are a little bit more defensive. Well, actually, the best comparison would be the Hearthguard, of course, because there are also spears in melee. Spear Malice, but that does mean they've got a bonus fighting cavalry, inspiring nearby troops as well, and decent total defensive scores. Defensive skill of 10, obviously very high armour as well, as you would expect. Good shields, one of the best, if not the best unit of heavy skirmishing archers the game has to offer. Again, it's highly situational, that, because very rarely do you get a full strength unit against a full strength unit in a real battle situation, but very, very strong. Obviously not the most damaging either at range, considering how much they cost, or in melee because of the spears, but obviously they are a little bit more defensively orientated anyway. So now we shall move on to not only the cavalry and the artillery, but the rest of UMBAR's skirmishers. So the cavalry force is actually a little bit more substantial than I remembered it being, because I forgot they actually had access to the mercenaries, but it's a good thing I didn't list cavalry as one of their weaknesses, because technically it's not, although the cost, as we will go into, is still fairly hefty if we want to field UMBAR's cavalry at its fullest. They've got their artillery, but we'll start off by mopping up what remains of their skirmishers, their non-archer skirmishers on foot. And the Corsair crossbows are a big part, honestly, of what UMBAR tend to do, especially in sieges, because the damage that crossbows can kick out is obviously very substantial. Again, missile attack of 10, armor piercing, plenty of punch behind them. The issue is, in melee they're very, very bad, and also the armor being so low means that they are very dependent on being able to hide anywhere. Obviously they're not hiding now because they've got the general in their unit. They can hide anywhere, and that's something you will absolutely be needing to do in order to safeguard them, because they will be one of the main things that your opposition is looking for in terms of trying to focus them down with archers, because of the damage they can do and because of how weak they can be to arrow fire. But still, that damage they can kick out is potentially invaluable. Something which has maybe a little bit less of a weakness to it, and you would consider these, along with the fencers, to be the elites of the Corsairs, the best the pirates have to offer. The Corsair Blackguards, a strong unit of sort of medium infantry, javelin hybrids. You can see in terms of their total defense, that defensive skill is pretty damn good. The armor's not bad. The shield value really helps as well, because this is the sort of unit which, again, archers, if they see it's unshielded, would absolutely be going after them. But here, they might want to think twice, because the armor and shield together can mitigate a decent amount of that damage. Good missile attack, and again, in melee, decent. I mean, for 700, considering the stats, really not bad at all. Effectiveness against armor on those javelins as well, causing fear. Just in general, a really good supporting unit for your front line, honestly, because UMBAR's front line is already pretty scary. So when you support it with the Corsair Blackguards doing a decent amount of damage at range, you can then close up in melee and support them when all is said and done with another wave of medium infantry, which is always a nice thing. And as we will see at a later date, this is something that they take directly from their ancestors. So yeah, really strong unit in general to have alongside your army, the Corsair Blackguards. Cavalry is not really something that the Númenóreans are super known for, and I guess the mercenaries could be from any part of Middle-earth. This is a unit that we've already seen, of course, when we were talking about the dwarves and a couple of others. Again, an entry-level unit of melee cavalry, so they can be used in a more defensive aspect, especially when you combine them with the rest of what UMBAR have on horseback, especially at the high end. They can make for a good blocker unit. Again, effectiveness against armor and bonus against cavalry. The main issue that mercs do have, in stark contrast really to much of the rest of the UMBAR army, is morale can be a real problem. It says good morale there, but that is an absolute lie. Again, defensively as well, defensive skill relatively poor because they're macemen. Not bad armor, not bad shields, but only so many of them. Not too expensive though. They're really just a sort of foil for some of the stronger cav units. Something which you're more likely to see used in its own, well, on its own merit really, would be the mercenary crossbows, because it gives you that mobility, but it also gives you that really strong ranged damage as well. Actually stronger even than the Corsair crossbows on foot, but they are arguably even more vulnerable because there are less of them. They're a pretty big target, and it's much harder to conceal their presence. So the enemy are always going to be on the lookout for them, but still, we have seen many examples in the past, both on the field and in a siege, of this unit being used to really good effect because of that mobility. So a lot of this is going to come down to how well you can utilise them as an individual player. Something a little bit more aggressive would be the Ardenaeum Lancers that we see here. Strong unit of regular lance cavalry, albeit 900 is quite expensive. They don't have access to that heightened charge bonus of 20 either, which is obviously very important for a unit of lancers like this. They do have an armour upgrade as well, although I do believe it doesn't actually change much. I think it... Oh no, it does give them the upgraded helms, which is nice. But yeah, strong. Again, armour is not exactly their weakness anyway, but you can buff that a little bit if you want. Good shield, so being zoned out by archers is less of a concern for the Ardenaeum, but they have the same issues as every other unit of pure lance cavalry, in the sense that if they do get pinned down by melee cav, that can be a problem for them, especially when you're paying this much. But still, regular lancers can be effective in this version of the game now, unlike the previous patch. And then 2 bodyguard cavalry units, which is not a luxury many factions have now. Obviously, fielding both is going to be very expensive. 1500 for the Warlords of UMBAR, which is the lance bodyguard unit of cavalry, the Knights. because they do have that bonus against other cavalry units, effective against armour off the charge, of course, fear causing as well, and inspiration also, though, as we've said many times now, on cavalry that is a little bit less important than the fear causing because of how much they move around. 1500, obviously the full whack, and then 8 and 20 is fairly standard fare. It's the defense scores where cavalry tend to diverge a little bit. 2 hit points, the shield value tends to move around a bit, as does the armor and the defensive skill. But again, cavalry is a little bit more about how quickly you can be utilizing them as a player rather than purely the stats. Obviously the stats do help, but it is going to come down to player skill, I think, certainly. And then more of a defensive cavalry unit to help safeguard your infantry, the Alcarondas Faithful. A little bit more expensive, but perhaps that's because it's more in line with what UMBAR are all about as a faction. 33 per unit, again, attack of 16. That really strong in melee feel to them. 2 hit points only again, but rather than like 3 hit points, but 3 hit points on cavalry would be a little bit silly after all. Good armor, good defensive skill. Get them into melee with other cavalry, and then they will stand and fight for a long, long time. Combine them with the mercenaries, and you've got a really good blocking force, but you do have the option to go full lancers as well, with the Ardenaeum and the Harbingers, or well, the Warlords of UMBAR, I should say, or a mixture of both. Be very greedy to bring both units of bodyguard cav though. And finally, the Trebuchet of Numenor, which we have seen a few times before. Dol Amroth, Cardlan, Arthur Dane, etc. UMBAR, of course, have got their own colour scheme with their burgundy red, and it's the same story here as well. Obviously, the Warhammers in melee are quite nice. UMBAR, of course, after all, in terms of armour piercing, in melee are more limited to just that entry-level unit of Axeman. Otherwise, they're going to have to use the crossbows and javelins, or these guys. But of course the main event has to be the Trebuchet itself. Recently we have seen the downsides of using Trebuchets, because friendly fire is the sort of thing which can devastate your own army as much as the enemy's, and UMBAR, especially if you hit an important unit, that can be really, really key. UMBAR are all about having those linchpin kind of units at the centre of their force after all, and then using their superior brutality to try and grind the enemy down. There are other factions in the game like that, and I think UMBAR, you have to be a little bit more careful with your composition, as I've said. But the Trebuchet can be the sort of thing to really help equalise against factions that either have got vastly superior numbers, like the Orcs, or potentially if you want to do a lot of damage very quickly to a superior quality force like the Elves, then the Trebuchet, if you get lucky with it, can be very important. Obviously in a siege as well. I think you're less likely to see it on the open field, though, because of how risky it can potentially be. The crew is good, but 1200 is a lot of money that you could be spending elsewhere, and like I've said, UMBAR may be a little bit more challenging to build your compositions with than other factions. They can be just as effective, but you've got to be a little bit more careful, I think, with how you build them. But there we have it, the forces of UMBAR down there in the south of Middle-earth. And next we will be moving on to their ancestors, and it's going to be quite similar really, because it's a force that does share a few units with UMBAR. Next time we will be looking, of course, at the forces of Numenor. So, I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll join me for that.